seam on the outside of the bowl. I'm Spiro with SP Wood Art. So I hope you stay with me, and we'll have a good time. If you have subscribed and you're one of my subscribers, thank you very much for being a subscriber. And I hope you enjoy my videos. I hope you stay with me, and we'll have a good time. If you have not subscribed, please feel free to do so. So in light of Halloween, or Hallows Eve, I am going to turn a small wooden bowl, probably about 7 inches, and I'm going to use a piece of white oak, which I have never turned before, so it ought to be interesting. And this piece is segmented out of 2 pieces of wood and glued together, and there's a seam around the middle, as you can see here. And I want to hide that seam, so I'm going to show you what I do to hide that seam. So I hope you stick around and enjoy the show. Thanks. Alright, let's just head over to the studio. Eh? That was weird. I better not step in that. Alright, keep it moving, Spiro. Keep it moving. And there you have my spooky holiday Halloween intro. Anyway, here is my bowl blank of white ash. It is about 7 inches in diameter by 3.5 inches deep. So this blank has been cut on several places on the side to round it as much as possible before turning. And I'm just going to take my center finder and work my way around, making several lines, and then I'll mark the center with a hole punch. Next, I'll use my hand drill with an 8mm drill bit and just drill down a ways. It doesn't really matter. Just enough where I have some space to add my woodworm screw for my 4-jaw scroll chuck. Normally I use my drill press, but this was more convenient at the time. I didn't feel like mounting this blank to my drill press table. Here I'll start adding my woodworm screw to the blank, just to get it started before I put it on the lathe. Now I know I've probably mentioned this in previous videos, but it is very important to inspect your wood thoroughly before you turn. Especially on a piece like this where I've glued it together, to make sure nothing's going to fly off and hit me, or there's cracks that could develop into a major problem when I start turning. And this particular piece, as you can see where I'm pointing, has a few cracks that run down the side, but not on the left side. So I'm going to make the footer on the right side and the top of the bowl on the left. That way I can hopefully turn away the cracks. And I know this may not be the most efficient way to turn, but I'll stop periodically just to keep an eye on those cracks to make sure none of these pieces fall off or come flying off at me. So I'll start with my square carbide cutter, and I'm going to rough the blank round. And in this shot I'm just going to clean up the face of the wood a little bit. And then once I have the blank round, I'll switch over to my round carbide cutter, and I'll start shaping the outside profile of the bowl. Now for this bowl, I have kind of envisioned a larger round bottom that tapers up to a smaller top. I would also like to turn a footer on the bowl, just a small one, to give it some more height. Now you can use the golden rule or the golden mean or the golden ratio or the Fibonacci series or any of those designing aids, which are good, and sometimes I use them, but I'm just going by my own vision on this bowl, and I end up doing that a lot actually. You can also see here that I'm stopping and checking the cracks periodically, as I had mentioned before. And luckily, at this point, I have found out that the cracks have disappeared off of the bottom of the bowl, which is great, and I kind of lucked out on that. Here you can see that I've started to make the footer of the bowl. Now that I'm pretty pleased with the shape of the bowl and it's kind of what I wanted, I'm just taking some really light shearing cuts on the outside of the bowl so I don't have to do as much sanding later. Now for the fun part of disguising that outside seam, I'm going to take my skew, a 1-inch skew, and use it vertically and stick the point of that right in the seam, and then make a second line to the right of it, maybe like a 1/2 inch away, but I'm doing that line, the second line, towards the end of the bowl. And you can see here that the seam is now disguised or gone. Next, I'm going to start with a 100 grit sandpaper and work my way up to 600 grit. Here, I'll just try to move the light out of the way so you can see some of that fabulous grain. And then I'm going to take some rubbing alcohol and just clean up some of the sanding dust and grit. Oh, and this is a 91% alcohol, rubbing alcohol. And someday I'll get myself a 99% alcohol, rubbing alcohol. Here I'm just using my compass to mark out where I want the recessed tenon. Then I'll use a 3/8 inch bowl gouge to clear out the bulk of this material. Next, I'll use my 1-inch skew chisel horizontally to clean up the face of the recess and to make a dovetail on the inner side of the walls. Then I'll do a quick sand on these newly carved spots of the recess. Now I'm going to add some texture between the two lines on the outside of the bowl using my Robert Sorbet micro spiraling tool. And you want to make sure you turn down the speed to at least about 500. And then I'm just going to do a few little cuts in between here, and that's all I need. Here's a close-up of the texture, and you can also see here that I don't think I mentioned this before, but I had glued both pieces of wood blanks together with the grains opposing each other. That way, they look like they're both gravitating towards the band on the bowl. Once again, I'll do another quick sand on here. I think this is a 600 grit to knock off any pieces that the texturing tool may have left. That is, any pieces of like fuzzy grain that might be sticking out. Next, I'm going to add some color to the textured band on the outside of the bowl using some art markers, or you can use some Sharpies. They're kind of the same thing, other than the art markers, I believe, in my opinion, seem to have more pigment in them, and they're darker when you use them. I'm running at about 500 RPMs right now, and I'm going to start with a black marker with a art brush tip on it. Then I'm going to add another element of interest by adding this olive green to the black, and I'm going to do this one with the lathe off and try to fill in a lot of the textured gaps and valleys with the green. Now, to reverse chuck this bowl later to clean up the bottom of the bowl, I'm just going to mark the center in the middle of the recess with my tailstock. Now I'm going to use my go-to friction polish, which is equal parts of boiled linseed oil, de-waxed shellac, and denatured alcohol. And I'll apply that with a dry paper towel. And you want to make sure that you don't put any of the friction polish over the marker yet. Then I'll turn up my lathe speed to about 2000 RPMs with a dry paper towel, and burnish the friction polish. And also at this point still you want to avoid touching the marker. Now I'm going to apply some antique gold gilders paste to the band, and it can get inside the pores, especially on this white ash, which has pretty noticeable pores to the eyes. They're pretty big. So I've decided to mask out the line with some painter's tape. And I've never actually tried this, so I'm going to see if it actually works. And here is the gilder's paste that I'm going to use. And I'm just going to apply it with my finger. Just a little bit on there. And I'm not going to rub it too hard. Just lightly on the surface. And hopefully the painter's tape will help the paste to only stay on the band and not get any in the pores on the sides of the band. Now you'll want to let the gilder's paste sit for about 15 minutes to dry, and then take a paper towel, a dry paper towel, and buff the gilder's paste. The thing about the gilder's paste, which is nice, is if you leave it, it'll have a satin sheen finish, and if you buff it, it'll get shiny because it's basically colored wax. Now I'll just remove the painter's tape with the lathe off, please. Safety first, you know. And this part, I had some trouble finding where the seam was for the tape to pull it off. So I think eventually I just grabbed the side of it and just ripped the tape off. And the painter's tape worked. I will definitely use this method in the future for coloring. It worked really well. And here you can see I'm using a pair of vice grips because the bowl was really stuck on the screw, and it helps to loosen it pretty well. The handle comes down and locks on the bed of the lathe, and then you can take the bowl off pretty easily if it's stuck. You can also use this method for your chuck if it's stuck as well. And here I'm just going to take out my woodworm screw, and then I'm going to have to change out my jaws because these are too big for the recess that I've put on the bowl. For those of you that do have this Nova Infinity chuck, I'm switching over to my #1 sawtooth jaws, which are longer than my bowl jaws. They still have a dovetailed taper end, but they also have teeth on the inside. Now I'm going to work on coring the inside of the bowl out, and I'm going to use my round carbide cutter, which removes a lot of material really fast. Now with this particular shape of bowl, I believe that the wall thickness is either going to make this piece not very pleasing or very pleasing. So I'm going to go with a thinner wall on this piece. Here is a couple of design tips that I find useful. If you're going to go with a thinner wall on a piece, ask yourself some questions as will this type of wood warp if it's too thin? Will it crack? Is the internal stress of the bowl, especially as you're turning it, will that create cracks or, possibly blow up or increase the strength of the bowl? They're just questions to ask yourself when you're designing the bowl. But I think with this particular white oak, which is very strong, I'm not going to have any problems having a thin wall. And you also want to think about what type of application your piece is going to be for. If this is going to be handled a lot, and the wall is really thin and flexible, it may end up just breaking over time with a lot of use. And here, I know this isn't the best light for the video, but I really needed to see what I was doing. It was getting a little hard to see in there, so I used my little flexi cordless light to see inside the bowl. And my face shield is in the way of the turning, so you can't see that. However, I'm working on making more tripods and camera slides and things so I can have better shots for future videos. So you should be seeing that soon. And these future suspended tripods will really help me to turn in my natural position rather than having to turn and move my body parts so the camera can see it. I can turn more naturally and not have to worry about my body parts or my face shield or things like that getting in front of the shot, which is nice. Now I'll switch over to my skew. This is a smaller skew I have. It's about a 1/2 inch skew, and it's rounded over on the front to one side. And this really helps me to get into that hard to reach spot on the left side of the bowl. Oh, I'm also using an S-curved tool rest here that I've made. Now I'm moving on to power sanding the inside of the bowl. You may be wondering that, well, hey, I disguised the outside seam, but what about the inside seam? Fortunately, I was able to just power sand. This is where my sander actually sander pad broke off the mandrel, so I had to fix that and put on a new one, and then I went back to sanding. So the seam actually was not that noticeable on the inside for some reason. So that means that maybe the outside of the blocks that were glued were not clamped together as tightly as the center. So all I needed to really do is sand the inside, and plus end grain is always tough to sand, so using the power sander just made this move pretty quickly and covered the seam line pretty well. Now, if that seam was noticeable on the inside, I would have made a band on the inside to match the outside band. Now I'm going to add a medallion in the center of the bowl, just a small one, that will sort of match the outside band. And I'm using my skew chisel here to make 2 lines to border the medallion. And here's the 2 lines. You can see it a little better in this close-up. Now I'm going to texture the medallion using my Robert Sorry spiraling tool, and I'm going to turn it towards the rotation of the spinning bowl. And this will give it a more of a starburst pattern, starting from the center and moving out to the border lines. Then I'll just do a quick sand of the medallion to knock down any fuzzy wood pieces sticking out. And then I will continue on to coloring the medallion. I'm going to do the border lines and the entire medallion in black, and then I'll go back and add some of the olive green to give it some point of interest, and then I will come back and do a light coating of the antique gold, the Gilder's paste. Next, I'll use more of my friction polish and put that all over the inside of the bowl, avoiding the medallion for right now. And this wood was really soaking it up on the inside, so I just decided to squeeze a little puddle in there and rub it around, and that seemed to work better than rubbing it on little by little. At this time, I will apply the friction polish to the outside band, making sure that I only wipe inward or up and down over the band because you don't want to spread the ink anywhere. And for the inside medallion, I'm just going to sponge it on to get in the crevices. Then I will let these dry. I'm not going to burnish the medallion or the band. Then next, as you can see, I'm going to reverse chuck my bowl and clean up the bottom pedestal a little bit and add a couple of lines or borders on the inside of the recess where I can just add my name and date and the type of wood. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I had a lot of fun making this bowl. It was tough wood to turn. It took me a while to rough the bowl out. I would definitely turn white oak again. It has a wonderful grain and it came out well. Happy holidays to everybody and stay safe.